15-state southern region burns. I pulled data from the 2015 National Prescribed Fire Council Fire Use Report. And this chart displays prescribed fire for forestry purposes for the various regions of the U.S. And you can see the vast majority of prescribed burning is conducted in the southern U.S. Because that southeastern region also produces a large proportion of the nation's softwood and hardwood timber and forest products, there's really a need to balance the ecological goals and objectives associated with prescribed burning, particularly on public lands, with the continued production of high-quality hardwood and softwood saw timber and other non-timber ecosystem goods and services, including aesthetics, wildlife habitat, recreation habitat. So across upland forests of the central hardwood region, there are really a multitude of reasons why public and private landowners implement burns. And these include to reduce hazardous fuels and future fire hazard, create a diversity of wildlife habitats across space and time, and then really to reintroduce a disturbance that was common to but now largely absent from the landscape. And that's done in order to restore structure, composition, and function in fire-adapted landscape, increase ecological complexity across spatial and temporal scales, and this is a big one in the hardwood and mixed pine hardwood forest types, control species composition, namely to promote and sustain oak and hickory species while reducing the abundance of mesophytic and shade-tolerant species in that forest mid-story and understory. So this really just depicts some of those goals and objectives associated with reintroducing an historic disturbance, namely fire, back to the landscape. In mixed pine and pine-dominated systems, for example, shortleaf, fire may be reintroduced for the purposes of controlling hardwood encroachment in the forest understory, creating more open understory conditions and promoting the growth and establishment of a vigorous and diverse herbaceous community, and promote the establishment of those desirable shortleaf pine seedlings. Similar can be said about reintroducing fire into hardwood-dominated systems. Here, fire may be reintroduced for the purposes of controlling the density and abundance of shade-tolerant species, such as black gum and red maple in the mid-story and understory layers. The goal here is often to create more open understory conditions, promote the growth and development of that diverse herbaceous community, and then to promote the growth and development and eventual recruitment of difficult to regenerate oak and hickory species. So key to creating those desired conditions through prescribed burning, such as reducing stand density and creating those open forest conditions, is controlling the amount of mortality that occurs during burning and what species are killed. Upland forests of the southern U.S. and central hardwood region in general are some of the most diverse temperate forests in the world. Species in these forests possess a diversity of functional traits that may influence their susceptibility to fire-induced mortality. For example, bark thickness, which is directly related to the amount of heat the cambium can withstand before damage, varies greatly among the species, with a species like white oak possessing significantly thicker bark than, say, a shade-tolerant species like flowering dogwood or red maple. So because many of the objectives associated with burning are directly related to controlling density and species composition through fire-induced mortality, and because using fire to achieve restoration purposes is only really going to increase into the future, there is really a need for decision support tools to accurately forecast fire effects, including species-specific fire-induced mortality, in order to develop future burn prescriptions and then forecast the effects of alternative burning regimes on structure and composition across the landscape and over time. So in the central hardwood region, we have some fire effects models available to us to forecast tree mortality, and these include the southern variant to the fire and fuel, or the southern variant of the fire and fuels extension to the forest vegetation simulator, the first order fire effects model, or FOFEM, and then Behave Plus. The decision support tools are capable of modeling physical and ecological attributes of prescribed burning and wildfire events, including predicting species-specific mortality. FOFEM, or the first order fire effects model, is the primary model predicting post-fire mortality, and is actually embedded into other models such as Behave and FBS. So although these models produce estimates of post-fire tree mortality for eastern tree species, the equations that drive the mortality were created using data obtained from conifer forests in the West. What that means is that the covariates and model coefficients used to predict mortality of Douglas fir, for example, in the west, are the same as those used to predict mortality of red maple, white oak, dogwood, and all the other species in the east. Now, an exception is with the southern variant of the fire-infused extension to the forest vegetation simulator, where for 8 species, chestnut oak, scarlet oak, northern red oak, black oak, hickory, red maple, black gum, and serviceberry, post-fire mortality is actually predicted using equations derived from data collected following a single wildfire event in Virginia. So actually, the species being modeled, the data were used to build those models for those species. So the applicability of these western-centric mortality equations to eastern tree species has not been tested, and because these equations were built with data outside the geographic range of application, let alone across completely different functional groups, there is a potential these equations will introduce error into model forecasts and really misrepresent the ecological effects of prescribed burning. And this is especially problematic when prescribed burning operations are conducted in efforts to modify and control species composition. So let's get into some detail about how current fire effects and behavior models predict tree mortality. In FOFEM, and for all but those 8 species I mentioned on the previous slide, the FFE, FES, the probability of mortality is modeled using an equation developed by Ryan and Amon. They use data collected from approximately 2,400 trees following prescribed fire in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington to predict the probability of tree mortality. In this equation, the probability of individual tree mortality, which is a continuous value between 0 and 1, is predicted as a function of bark thickness and the percent of crown volume scorched. Crown volume scorched is a function of crown length scorched, which is estimated using estimates or measurements of scorch height or predicted flame length. And bark thickness in this equation is estimated as a linear relationship between a species-specific multiplier and DBH. In the southern variant of FFE, FBS, there are 8 species. Those 8 species I mentioned, for which mortality is modeled using an equation derived from data collected following a wildfire event in Virginia. For all the other species outside of those 8, the southern variant uses the FOFEM equation. For these 8 species, however, the probability of tree mortality, again, a continuous variable between 0 and 1, is predicted from diameter breast height, so not bark thickness like in FOFEM, and then maximum height of bole blackening, which is in this picture just kind of the maximum height of char that you see on the stem. So given that background information, we had 2 main objectives. We wanted to validate how well the post-fire tree mortality equations embedded in FOFEM and FFE, FBS predict tree mortality of southern U.S. species. And then we also wanted to develop new species-specific post-fire mortality models for hardwood tree species common throughout the central hardwood region using easily obtained tree and fire effects data. I'll say objective number 1 was originally presented at the 2017 FBS conference and subsequently published as a proceedings paper. And then objective 2 was recently published in the International Journal of Wildland Fire. So moving on, so the validation and model development data set. The validation data and the development model came from 244 quarter-acre plots that were established in 94 burn units throughout National Park Service lands in the east. Prior to burning, trees were tagged and species status and DBH were recorded. Most of these burns were conducted during the late dormant to early growing seasons between 1997 and 2012. Within about a month post-fire, direct fire effects on individual trees were recorded. These direct fire effects included scorch height, which was measured from the ground to the highest point in the crown where foliar death was evident, and then char height, which was measured from the ground level to the highest point on the bole where char was evident regardless of slope position. Status, so live and dead, of individual trees were recorded 2 years post-fire. And just as a caveat, the data set made no differentiation between trees that were top-killed and sprouting and trees that were essentially dead, main stem dead without any sprouts. So dead in this study could mean main stem dead or sprouting or complete mortality of the individual. So how well do current models predict mortality of these eastern tree species? For that, we need to validate. So to validate the FOFEM equation, we use that National Park Service data set and the batch processing function in FOFEM to calculate the probability of mortality for 15 species found in our data set. The variables required to run FOFEM include DBH, maximum scorch height, total tree height, and crown ratio. Maximum scorch height was entered into FOFEM as the maximum of scorch or char. So you'll remember scorch was the highest point where foliar death occurred. And because burns occurred during the dormant season when foliage of deciduous trees is absent, this measurement alone may underestimate the severity of this fire effect on hardwood, because you can't measure foliar death if you don't have any foliage. So because total tree height and crown ratio were not measured during data collection, we actually used the southern variant of the forest vegetation simulator to impute these variables. So that adds a little bit of source of error in the validation effort. However, crown ratio and total height of every single tree in a 10th hectare plot is rarely part of normal ecological inventory. So similarly, we use the National Park Service data set to predict mortality of those 8 species in FFS using the equation and model coefficients in the Regelbrug and Smith equation. And just a caveat that white oak is predicted using the equation specific to chestnut oak. They didn't differentiate. And then those 3 red oak species there were predicted using and made using a general red oak group equation. So a few details about what these models are predicting. The model that predicts post-fire tree mortality is a logistic function. The logistic function predicts a probability that an event happens, which in this case is tree mortality within 2 years post-burn. The probability of mortality is a continuous value between 0 and 1. Mortality, however, is binary, right? A tree is either alive or it's dead. Therefore, cutoff values are used in FOFEM to signal mortality, and in many cases, FOFEM in particularly, the default cutoff is 0.5 to signal mortality. So if the probability of mortality is below 0.5, the tree is predicted to live, whereas if it's greater than 0.5, the tree is predicted to die. So classification tables were used to assess fit in the validation. For classification tables, we chose a cutoff value of 0.5 because this is the standard one used in FOFEM. The values in the classification table reflect, I'm going to give you some definitions here, sensitivity, which I'm going to call the true mortality rate, which is the proportion of dead trees that were correctly predicted to die. Specificity, which I will call the true survival rate, is the proportion of live trees correctly predicted to live. And then I'm also going to present the false mortality rate, which is the proportion of live trees incorrectly predicted to die, with high values indicating the model over-predicted mortality. And then the false survival rate, which is the proportion of dead trees that were incorrectly predicted to live by the model. High false survival rates indicate that mortality was under-predicted by the model. So the validation. The next few slides will describe the actual validation data. This figure displays the sample size for each of the species, categorized by status, live, dead. So you can see we had a really good sample size for most of these species, with sample sizes greater than 200 for all but 3 species that we did end up validating. As a proportion, white oak and shortleaf pine had some of the lowest mortality rates, while sassafras and Virginia pine had some of the highest rates of mortality in the data set. Here's the range of tree sizes in that validation data set broken out by species. The values here represent minimum, lower quartile, median, upper quartile, and maximum values. As a whole, median values range from a low of 4.3 for sassafras, so pretty small, centimeters, to approximately 30 centimeters breast height for scarlet oak. And I just depict this because in the models that we developed, we don't really want to extrapolate beyond the data set here. So this is just to give you an idea of what those data look like. The fires that occurred were of low intensity, which we can infer by the severity of fire effects observed in the data set. This figure presents data on the range of char values observed in that validation data set. So char, again, is that maximum height on the bull where char bull blackening occurred. Again, values are the minimum, lower quartile, median, upper quartile, and maximum value. Across all species in the validation data set, median char heights averaged 0.4 meters, which is about 1.3 feet. So again, pretty low intensity burns, which is typical in first time burned forests in the central hardwood region. So instead of char, this shows the range of scorch, which is that maximum height of foliage death. Again, broken up by species, values represent the same thing: minimum, lower quartile, median, upper quartile, and maximum. Remember that because most burns were in the dormant season when foliage damage can't be assessed, and because of the low intensity nature of the burns, the median scorch values in the data set is actually 0. There's quite a range within a given species, but the median values did average 0 across the species. All right, the next 5 slides are going to display the validation statistics for that FOFEM equation for the 15 species median sample size requirements. Remember, FOFEM was developed using western conifer species. You're going to have to excuse all the slides. I tried to summarize all the information into a single table on a single slide, but that was way too overwhelming. So this figure displays general accuracy of the FOFEM equation. Accuracy describes the proportion of trees whose status was correctly predicted, regardless of whether we were trying to predict mortality or survival. The larger the number, the better the accuracy. So total accuracy of the FOFEM equation for these 15 species ranged from a low of 17% correctly predicted for sourwood to 71% correctly predicted for chestnut oak. The ability of the FOFEM equation to accurately predict the status of all species was less than 75% for all species combined, with 6 of the 15 species highlighted in purple below 50%. So accuracy was less than 50% for red maple, dogwood, hickory, black gum, sourwood, and white pine. Virginia pine. So this figure displays the true mortality rate of the FOFEM validation. Again, using that 0.5 cutoff value. Remember, true mortality rate is the proportion of trees that died that were predicted to die by the model. The greater the value, the greater the ability FOFEM had to predict mortality. In general, the ability of the FOFEM equation to predict mortality was good, with values greater than 70% for 9 of the 15 species. The 7 species in purple had true mortality rates equal to or within 10% of perfect. So for example, all of the red maple stems that died, the FOFEM model actually predicted them to die. So it seems like a pretty good statistic that it can predict the mortality really well. However, to better understand that true mortality rate, we have to understand the false mortality rate as well, which, if you remember, is the proportion of trees that survived but were predicted to die by the model. Here, the higher values indicate the model over-predicted mortality. So the false mortality rate varied among the species from a low of 27% for chestnut oak to 100% for sassafras. Overall, 8 of the 15 highlighted in purple species possess false mortality rates greater than 50%. That means that for 8 species, over 50% of the live trees were modeled as dead. So for red maple, which I think we all in the East like to pick on here, FOFEM had a 95% false mortality rate, meaning that 95% of the trees that survived were actually predicted to die by the model. So although the model predicted mortality well, and too well, given the false mortality rate, that ability came at a cost, and that cost was in terms of the ability to predict survival. So this is true survival, proportion of live trees that were predicted to survive the model. The greater the value, the greater the ability of FOFEM to predict survival. In general, the prediction of survival by FOFEM was variable, with values ranging from 1% for dogwood to 72% for pitch pine. In purple are the 8 species for which FOFEM predicted survival at a rate less than 50%. You can see that for red maple, the ability to predict survival was really low because it was over-predicting mortality, as we saw in that previous slide. Corresponding to that is the false survival rate. Again, proportion of trees that were observed dead but predicted live. High values indicate the model underpredicted mortality. False survival rates were all over the place, ranging from 0% for red maple, dogwood, black gum, and sassafras to a high of almost 80% for pitch pine, which is the only species for which false survival rates exceeded 50%. All right, hang with me. You're going to see these 5 slides again, but it's just going to be for the equation in FFE FVS, which again developed using data from Virginia specific to these species. So overall accuracy of the FFE equation was quite high. Total accuracy ranged from a low of 75% to a high of, for black oak, to a high of 92% for hickory, white oak, and chestnut oak. So pretty good accuracy of the FFE equation here. The true mortality rate of that FFE equation was over 50% for 6 of the 8 species. So, for example, for black oak, the FFE equation was able to accurately predict mortality, again at that 0.5 cutoff value of almost 70% of the stems observed to be dead 2 years following burning. In contrast, for black gum, the FFE equation only accurately predicted 34% of the actual dead black gum stems. False mortality rate, with the exception of red maple, the false mortality rate was less than 25%, with 4 of the 8 species examined possessing false mortality rates less than 10%, which are these highlighted in purple. For red maple, the FFE equation overpredicted mortality by almost 60%, meaning that almost 60% of the live trees were modeled or predicted to be dead. But in general, false mortality rates or model over prediction was relatively low compared to what we saw in the FOFEM equation. So this is the true survival rate. The ability of FFE to accurately predict survival was good for 7 of the 8 species, with those true survival rates exceeding 75%. The exception again was red maple, where the FFE equation only predicted survival of approximately 40% of those red maple stems observed and recorded as living. Corresponding to that true survival rate or true positive rate is the false survival rate. Here, values range from a low of 36% for black oak to a high of 53% for hickory species. This means that at the high end of the range, the FFE equation underestimated mortality by upwards of 53%. So, given the data, which model performed better, FOFEM or FFE for our data set? Well, for red maple, hickory, black gum, and white oak, FOFEM predicted true mortality quite a bit better than FFE. Not much difference in the true mortality rate was observed between the 2 models for scarlet, chestnut, and black oak. However, the ability of FOFEM to predict mortality at that really high rate came at a cost, and that is seen in that false survival rate presented on the right. You can see that for all species, but especially for red maple, hickory, black gum, and white oak, the overprediction of mortality exceeded 40% in the case of white oak and over 90% for red maple. So those Western developed species overpredicted mortality at a higher rate than the equation that was developed using data collected and modeled for individual species. How do the models compare when examining survival? Well, this is pretty clear cut. The model built with data from the actual species being tested here predicted survival at a much higher rate than the FOFEM equation, which was modeled using data built again from those Western tree species. So it seems that if you gather data and do the statistics using the data collected for that actual species, it performs better. So that led us to our next objective, which was to develop some new post-fire mortality models, species-specific post-fire mortality models using that same National Park Service data set. So we used that National Park Service data set to develop these new species-specific mortality models to predict mortality 2 years after prescribed burning. And we did this using 2 variables, diameter breast height and maximum height of stem char, which I'm just going to call char. These variables were utilized for a variety of reasons. First reason, they're easily incorporated into FOFEM and FVS, DBH and char height. Those are 2 pretty simple variables to model. DBH is a morphological variable that's easily obtained during pre- and post-fire inventories. There's been a lot of work on post-fire mortality modeling in the West, and bark thickness, if you include bark thickness in your equation, it tends to perform better than DBH. However, DBH is a easily obtained variable when you're doing inventories out there. Relationships between DBH and bark thickness, which again is a variable that's going to predict post-fire mortality probably better than DBH alone, are generally unavailable for many of the upland hardwood tree species that we have as well. So DBH being the chosen variable there. And then char is a fire effects variable that's easily obtained during post-fire inventories and can be measured regardless of season of burn and whether or not the leaves are on or off of deciduous tree species in general. In order to develop species-specific models, a given species had to have a minimum of 40 dead trees in the data set, or this equated to 2 times the number of explanatory variables, or 20 times the number of explanatory variables, and 10 species met these minimum sample size requirements. So we're going to look at post-fire mortality models for red maple, dogwood, black gum, sourwood, white oak, scarlet oak, black jack oak, chestnut oak, black oak, and sassafras. So the accuracy of the models we developed was assessed using classification tables, so those true positives, true negatives, false positives, and false negatives, and then ROC curves. The ROC is a plot of the true positive rate versus the false positive rate across a range of cutoff values. In general, models with ROC values less than 0.7 are considered to be poor and not a good fit to the data. ROC values between 0.7 and 0.8 are considered acceptable. Values between 0.8 and 0.9, excellent, and then values greater than 0.9 are considered to have outstanding discrimination. So this figure presents information on the percentage of trees that died by species. The values at the end of the bars display the total sample size for each of the species for which we developed new models. You can see from the figure that 2-year mortality varied greatly among the 10 hardwood tree species. White oak experienced the lowest rate of mortality at approximately 70% or 7%, while sassafras experienced the greatest mortality at approximately 60%. All right, so these are the parameter estimates associated with the fitting of the new post-fire mortality models. You don't have to pay attention too much here because these are just a lot of numbers. However, I did want to point out a couple of things. In the table, the asterisks just indicate whether a variable was significant at 0.05 or 0.01 for statistical junkies on the webinar. So the first thing I want to point out is that DBH was a significant predictor of mortality for all species, and the parameter estimate is negative, which means that as tree size increases, the probability of mortality decreases, and that occurred across the 10 species examined. Number 2, char was a significant predictor of mortality for all species. The parameter estimate associated with char is positive, which it means that as char height increases, the probability of mortality increases. And then 3, the ROC values, again, which indicate the fit of the model, ranged from a low of 0.72 for dogwood to 0.96 for sassafras. And this suggests that the models we developed had an acceptable to outstanding fit to the data. So these figures display what those values on the previous slide actually mean in terms of post-fire tree mortality. For each species on this slide, the x-axis represents DBH, and the y-axis represents the probability of a tree dying within 2 years post-fire. The blue line on each figure is the probability of mortality when char height is 0.5 meters. The purple is when char height is 1.5 meters, and the green line is predicted probability of mortality when char height is 2.5 meters. You can see that for all species, probability of mortality is reduced at larger diameters and is increased at greater levels of char. One thing to point out is the differences among the species. For example, for small diameter white oak, the probability of mortality barely exceeds 0.5 when char is 2.5 meters in height, which is That's at the upper end of something char height you'd see in a low intensity burn. In contrast, for small diameter red maple, the probability of mortality is almost 100% at that 2.5 meter char height. So although this confirms what we all kind of knew already, right, that certain species are more susceptible to mortality than others, what this really does is quantify those relationships. It puts a value on the probability of mortality among these 10 species, so we can better assess mortality trade-offs in developing burn prescriptions among these species. So let's look at the model validity outside of the ROC values, which again suggests the statistical fit is acceptable for all the species we develop models for. This is accuracy of the model. So this is the proportion of trees whose status, whether live or dead, was correctly predicted by the models we developed at two various cutoff points. Remember, the probability of mortality is that's produced from these equations is a continuous value between 0 and 1, and we need to assign a cutoff value that will indicate whether a tree is alive or dead if we're going to assess these equations. So in the blue is the accuracy using the standard cutoff value that's used in FOFEM, and that is 0.5. So everything less than 0.5 predicted mortality is alive. Everything greater is dead. In the yellow is the model accuracy when the cutoff value is reduced to 0.2. So here, any predicted probability of mortality greater than 0.2 is that tree is going to be classified as dead. Overall, the cutoff value didn't change overall accuracy that much. Accuracy at the 0.5 cutoff ranged from a low of 74% for dogwood to a high of 95% for sassafras. At the 0.2 cutoff, accuracy ranged from a low of 54% for blackjack oak to a high of 93% for white oak. So for blackjack oak, that seemed to be the species that responded to different cutoff values more so than at a greater rate than the other species examined. So where we start to see the effect of the cutoff value is the true mortality rate, true survival rate, false mortality, and false negative. This figure shows the true mortality rate, proportion of trees observed to be dead that were correctly predicted to die at these two different cutoff values. At the 0.5 cutoff, the true mortality rate varied from a low of only 2% for scarlet oak to 95% for sassafras. In general, the true mortality rate was greater than 50% for only 5 of the 10 species examined at that 0.5 cutoff level. When we reduced the cutoff level, that true mortality rate increased for all species, with the true mortality rate at that 0.2 level ranging from 27% for scarlet oak to 95% for sassafras. When that 0.2 cutoff value was used, the true mortality rate was greater than 50% for 7 of the 10 species examined. For 3 oak species, white, scarlet, and chestnut, the change in the cutoff value was not sufficient enough to raise that true mortality rate above 50%, meaning that was kind of difficult to predict mortality of those species. This figure corresponds to the previous slide and represents that false mortality rate, so how much the model over-predicted mortality at those 2 cutoff values. At the 0.5 cutoff value, the false mortality rate was pretty low. It never exceeded 18%. While lowering the cutoff value to 0.2 increased the ability of the models to predict mortality, it came with a slight to large increase in that false mortality rate. So for example, decreasing the cutoff value for white oak only increased model over prediction of mortality, or the false mortality rate, from 1 to 2%, so no big deal. But decreasing that cutoff value for blackjack oak increased model over prediction from 12% to 62%. So in the case of blackjack oaks, at the 0.2 cutoff, 62% of the living blackjack oak trees would have been incorrectly predicted to die using the new models. This figure displays true survival rate using the newly developed equations. Much like we saw with the true mortality rate, the cutoff value makes a little bit of difference in that true survival rate. Regardless of the cutoff value, the ability of the model to predict survival was quite good. Using the 0.5 cutoff, black gum possessed the lowest true survival rate at 82%, so still pretty darn high. That's the lowest, but it's a high It's a pretty good ability to predict survival, while scarlet oak possessed the highest true survival rate at 100%, meaning almost 100% of scarlet trees that were living 2 years post-fire were predicted to live by the model. At the 0.2 cutoff, sassafras possessed the lowest true survival rate at 63%, while chestnut oak possessed the highest at 99%. So coupled with that true survival rate is the false survival rate. Remember, false survival is the proportion of trees observed and recorded as dead that were modeled or predicted to live. High values indicate the model's under-predicted mortality at a given cutoff. More of the same here, the cutoff definitely matters. At the 0.5 cutoff value, the false negative rate was greatest for scarlet oak at 98%, meaning that 98% of the dead trees were incorrectly classified as alive by the model. And it was lowest for sassafras. When using that 0.2 probability mortality cutoff, the false negative rate was highest again for scarlet oak at 73%, and lowest again for sassafras. So what does this all mean? Can we use Western-centric post-fire tree mortalities to predict mortality of eastern tree species? Not such a good idea. They really inadequately predicted mortality of the eastern tree species when we look at all the variables of the classification table, not just true mortality, but false mortality, true survival, and false survival. They just really did not perform very well. Total accuracy was all less than 75% for the 15 species examined. And they did more accurately predict, the FOFEM equation did more accurately predict mortality versus survival, but there were really high false mortality rates for those 15 species examined, which means FOFEM over-predicted mortality quite a bit. So why the low performance of the FOFEM equations? Well, let's just start with differences in functional attributes of hardwood trees that make them differ in their susceptibility to fire-induced damage and mortality than western conifer species. I think that's one of the primary factors here why FOFEM equations didn't fare so well when assessing mortality in eastern forests. 2, fire intensity and severity of fire effects associated with prescribed fires in eastern forests is quite low. That means that damage to the crown, which is a primary factor controlling mortality in the FOFEM equation, is quite limited. If there's no crown damage, because most of the burns are conducted during the dormant season when foliage is absent, or they just don't reach intensity enough to get into the crown, obtaining accurate estimates of the crown damage is difficult to impossible. And then 4, when scorch or char heights are actually below the live crown, so there's no crown damage, which again is often the case in these fires, then the FOFEM equation predicts mortality solely as a function of bark thickness. So let's look a little bit more at bark thickness here, which is often used as a surrogate for resistance of the cambium to fire damage. And we did not go and develop new bark thickness equations or look at all of this. We didn't have the funding or time to do that, so I'm just pulling from what other people have found here. So in FOFEM, bark thickness is calculated as a linear relationship with breast height using a species-specific multiplier. And it's assumed to be constant over the length of the stem. So that relationship is constant along the whole stem. So the bark thickness at the base of the bowl is assumed to be the same as it is at breast height, and which is the same, 30 feet off the ground. Data suggests that for many species, bark thickness varies along the bowl. So these on the right here are data from a study by Hammond and others, and it demonstrates for some species, especially blackjack oak here, where my pointer go here, sand hickory and persimmon, bark thickness is greatest at the base of the stem and decreases significantly by the time you get to roughly breast height. So in eastern hardwood forests, where fire intensity can be quite low, it's likely that bark thickness at the base of the stem is more of an important factor determining the effects of stem size and bark thickness relationships on mortality than a simple linear relationship that describes bark thickness at breast height, which is employed by FOFEM. So that's important. And then this, I just wanted to throw in there to highlight the importance of bark thickness. This table just quantifies the role of bark thickness on fire-related cambium damage. So these data came from a study published by Schwild and others and show the amount of time a tree can survive a fire at 500 degrees C without fatal damage by the size of the tree at 60 centimeters in height, so near the base of that tree. You can see that as tree size increases, and presumably bark thickness along with that the time to achieve fatal damage increases. For example, take chinkapin oak here, which is this line here. The time to achieve fatal cambial damage increases from 40 seconds when a tree is 10 centimeters in diameter near the base to 5 minutes and 30 seconds roughly when a stem is 30 centimeters near the base. Again, increases in fire tolerance is likely due to that increase in bark thickness associated with increased stem size. So better understanding of bark thickness and the bark thickness diameter relationships for eastern tree species and how that varies along the length of the stem is likely pretty important to further refining post-fire tree mortality models and actually better understanding the mechanistic cause of fire mortality in these species. So what about the efficacy of the FFE-FVS model? So these models were developed using species-specific data following a single wildfire event in Virginia. In general, they did pretty well. Total accuracy for all of the 8 species was greater than 75%. Unlike FOFEM, they more accurately predicted survival than mortality. So they had a low false survival rate. So they did fairly well. There were some differences. I didn't have time to show them all, but overall, not too bad. Much better than the FOFEM equations. So the validation effort supports the notion that models built with data outside the geographic range of application, let alone across completely disparate species and functional groups, results in poor model performance. It's no surprise that the relative importance of tree attributes and severity of fire effects on mortality and the probability of mortality differ between eastern and western species. The predicted probability of mortality that FOFEM equations predict, in particular when we use those to model the effects of prescribed burning or prescribed burning regimes, because of their over-prediction of mortality and under-prediction of survival, really have the potential to misrepresent the ecological effects of prescribed burning on species composition and stand density. And these are 2 attributes, species composition and stand density, actively managed through prescribed burning programs across upland forests of the Southeast. For example, if I were trying to assess the efficacy of a given burn prescription to cause mortality of red maple, the FOFEM equation would suggest that red maple is fairly easy to kill, when in fact the false mortality rate was quite high, 95% for red maple. So the results forecasted by the model would not actually represent what we know about red maple, that at some point red maple can be fairly resistant to mortality following even low intensity prescribed burning. So this over-prediction of mortality by the FOFEM model may lead a user to assume a burn is likely to achieve desired effects. And this may be a particularly big issue in an area where prescribed burning is conducted with goals of controlling mesophytic shade-tolerant species in the forest understory in efforts to promote more the growth, establishment, and recruitment of more fire-adapted species. So the post-fire mortalities that we developed using the National Park Service data used easily obtained tree and fire effects data. The models all had acceptable to outstanding fit. However, it's apparent that research and recommendations regarding appropriate cutoff values used to signal mortality in these models be made, as the cutoff value drastically changed the accuracy of prediction across species. And there's statistical ways to identify the most optimum cutoff value that we just didn't get into. The models we developed should be considered a step towards the development of short and long-term fire-related mortality models, but like all models, should be validated with independent data. It's important to note that we were unable to test for differences in mortality among the burn units or geographic areas due to the limited sample size for some species. For example, despite there being over 600 white oak trees, only 40 or so died across the entire study. So that really makes it almost impossible to statistically test for differences in mortality or relationships between breast height and fire severity effects on the probability of mortality across the study area. The models developed forecast mortality within 2 years post-fire. There's data out there that suggests mortality of eastern tree species can occur 4 to 5 years following fire. Also, these equations predict mortality after a single burn. Rarely are restoration or management objectives achieved with a single burn. Questions, therefore, on how multiple fires interact with fire-free periods to influence species-specific mortality remain. The only fire effects data that we used in the development of these new mortality models was height of stem char. Lack of more detailed fire effects data coupled with longer tree mortality data limited our ability to explore more complex relationships among delayed tree mortality and the myriad fire effects known to influence post-fire tree mortality. To improve upon or expand the use of the models we developed, we really recommend collecting additional data related to longer-term post-fire tree mortality, a much wider range of fire effects, such as duff consumption, direct and indirect measures of cambial damage, along with more detailed tree morphology characteristics, such as measured bark thickness along the stem, crown base height, and total tree height. And then just a broader range of burning conditions. How does climate prior to the fire, during the fire, after the fire influence tree mortality, delayed tree mortality? And then how does season of burn, as we look to expanding our burn windows in many of the southeastern forests, how does that influence fire mortality? So our data came from burns that were conducted primarily during the dormant season.
Feel free to type them into the chat box or
about
click
how
the icon at the
burning
top
into the early growing season or late growing season affects that probability of mortality. So those are all areas of focus that I hope folks
think about their comments and questions.
In the fire world begin to think about and look
just
into.
Generally, what do you think is the next step for this work?
Post-fire tree mortality in the future. And with that, we'll just thank the National Park Service, prescribed burn personnel, numerous NPS technicians responsible for collecting all this monitoring data, Mike Shettles, who helped out reviewing some papers, Duncan Lutz, fire ecologist and FOFEM manager, and then Stephanie Rebane, who was a former manager of the FFE FBS program.